The morning Pauline Quinn squeezed through the gap in Dexter Fairchild's fence. She was not looking for love. She was looking for a place to bury her dog. The year was 1883, and the dust of the New Mexico territory had a way of swallowing whole the things a person could not bear to lose. Pauline had been riding since before dawn, her sorrel mare moving at a slow walk because there was no urgency left in the world that morning, not with old Biscuit wrapped in a flour sack across the saddle horn. The dog had been her companion for 11 years, a brown and white hound with one torn ear and a disposition that was better than most men she had known. He had died sometime in the deep dark of the night, curled against her feet in the small room she rented above the general store in the town of Creta, New Mexico, and she had not been able to weep in that little room with its thin walls. So she had put him up on the horse and ridden out until the sky began to go from black to purple, and she could see the shape of the land. She had not intended to stop at the Fairchild property. She had ridden past it a dozen times in the 2 years she had lived in Creta, always noting the fence line of weathered cedar posts strung with rusted wire, always noting the way the land inside the fence looked different from the land outside it, greener somehow, cared for, intentional. There was a front gate that sat at the head of a lane leading up to a house she could barely see from the road, and the gate was always closed. People in town said Dexter Fairchild kept it closed because he preferred it that way. They said he had not opened it for company in 7 winters. They said a lot of things about Dexter Fairchild, the way people in small western towns always say things about a man who keeps to himself, and Pauline had always taken those things with the grain of salt she kept ready for such occasions. But that morning, with Biscuit wrapped in flour sack linen and her heart sitting somewhere down around her boot heels, she saw the gap in the fence and she pulled her mare to a stop. The gap was not dramatic. It was simply a place where 2 fence posts had leaned away from each other over the years, and the wire between them had loosened and sagged until a person could step through without tearing their skirt, if they were careful. There was a cottonwood tree just on the other side of the gap, an old one with roots that spread wide and bark the color of winter sky, and the ground beneath it was soft and shaded, and exactly the kind of place where a good dog ought to rest. Pauline dismounted. She tied her mare to one of the leaning posts. She carried Biscuit through the gap in her arms, the flour sack pressing against her chest, and she set him down gently beneath the cottonwood. Then she went back to the mare for the small folding shovel she kept in her saddlebag, because she was a practical woman who had learned that the frontier did not wait for a person to be prepared. She had been digging for perhaps 10 minutes when she heard the sound of boots on dry earth. She did not look up right away. She was aware that she was on someone else's property without permission, and she was aware that in the territory of New Mexico in 1883, this was a thing a person ought to be able to explain, and she was building her explanation in her head even as she drove the shovel into the pale dirt. "That your horse out there by the fence?" The voice was low and a little rough, the kind of voice that had spent more time talking to livestock than to people. Pauline set the shovel against the tree and turned around. Dexter Fairchild was not what the town of Creta described when it talked about him, which was to say he was not a monster or a ghost or a man so broken he had gone to dust himself. He was tall, lean in the way of men who work hard and forget to eat, with dark hair that had gone silver at the temples before its time and a jaw that held a few days of dark beard. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, she thought, maybe 34 or 35, which put him not much older than her own 29. He wore a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and trousers held up by suspenders, and he had a hat in his hand rather than on his head, which she later thought was interesting. He had taken it off before he spoke to her, a gesture so automatic and old-fashioned and polite that it stood out in a man who supposedly had no use for human company. "It is," Pauline said. "I apologize for coming onto your land without asking. I was going to apologize when I was finished." She paused. "My dog died last night. I wanted to bury him under a good tree." Dexter looked at the flour sack on the ground beneath the cottonwood. He looked at the hole she had started. He looked at her face, which she knew was dirty and probably showed the strain of a sleepless night, though she had not cried yet and did not intend to do so in front of a stranger. "The shovel is too small for the job," he said. "I know it," she said. He stood there for a moment, turning the hat in his hands. Then he turned and walked back toward the house without a word. Pauline watched him go and picked up her shovel and kept digging. She had made the hole maybe 8 inches deeper when she heard him coming back, and she turned to find him carrying a full-sized spade over one shoulder. He did not ask. He simply moved her to one side with a slight tilt of his head, stepped down into the shallow depression she had started, and began to dig properly. Pauline stood back and let him because the hole needed to be deeper, and she was tired, and Biscuit deserved better than a shallow grave. They did not talk while he dug. The morning was quiet around them, the kind of quiet that only lives out on the land far from town, with meadowlarks in the grass somewhere, and the sound of wind moving through the cottonwood leaves overhead. When the hole was deep enough, Dexter climbed out of it and stepped back, and Pauline picked up the flour sack and laid it in carefully and arranged it the way she wanted it and then stood up. She was not going to cry. She had decided. She cried anyway, just for a moment, just 2 or 3 tears that she wiped away quickly with the back of her wrist. She felt the man beside her go very still in the way people go still when they witness grief they were not expecting and do not know how to address. "He was a good dog," she said, because she felt she ought to say something. "What was his name?" "Biscuit." Dexter nodded, as though this was a perfectly reasonable name for a dog, which it was. He picked up the spade and filled the hole, and Pauline found a flat stone nearby and set it at the head of the grave, and then they stood there together for a moment in the dappled shade of the cottonwood, with the bird noise around them and the territory spreading out in all directions like something that did not care very much about the small dramas of human hearts. "I'm Pauline Quinn," she said. "I work at the assay office in Creta." "I know who you are," he said. He put his hat on. "Dexter Fairchild." "I know who you are too," she said. He almost smiled. It was a very small thing, barely a movement, but it was there. "I expect you do," he said. She retrieved her mare from the fence post and rode back toward Creta, and she did not think about Dexter Fairchild for the rest of that day, because she had Biscuit to grieve and her regular work to do at the assay office, where the miners brought their samples, and she weighed them and recorded them, and tried to be fair about it, even when the company men breathed down her neck about how the numbers ought to look. She thought about him the day after. She thought about the way he had simply taken the spade and dug without making it into anything, without asking questions or making conversation or turning it into an opportunity to speak at length about himself, the way men so often did. He had just done the thing that needed doing, and then stood in the shade with her without requiring anything of her in return. She was a woman who had come to the territory alone, which was not unheard of in 1883, but was not exactly common either. She had come from Missouri 2 years prior, following a position that had been advertised in a St. Louis paper, Assier's assistant in the New Mexico territory. The ad had read, and she had folded the paper and looked out her window at the Missouri winter and thought, why not? She had left behind a life that had not been bad exactly, just small. A brother who was kind but busy. A mother who was gone. A man she had thought she might marry who had turned out to be a man she could not respect. She had packed what she owned into 2 trunks, purchased a horse, and ridden west by way of the railroad when she could afford it and by saddle when she could not. She had been in Creta 2 years, and she had made a life there that suited her. She had a room above the general store owned by a woman named Harriet Oakes, who was sharp and generous and did not pry. She had her work at the assay office, which she had moved from assistant to lead Assier in 14 months because she was very good at the job. She had a small reputation in town for being competent and fair, which she valued above most other reputations. She had friends of a sort, Harriet, and a woman named Clara Bento who ran the laundry, and a Mexican vaquero named Rodrigo who worked the cattle drives and stopped in Creta between them and played cards with her on Tuesday nights when the saloon was quiet. She did not have a husband and was not looking for one. She had looked for one once and decided the looking had been a waste of good energy. And yet she thought about Dexter Fairchild. She thought about him again a week later when she rode out of town at dusk on a Wednesday, following the road that went past his fence line, because it was the road that led to the mesa overlook where she liked to sit when the world felt too small. She did not slow down when she passed the gap in the fence. She looked at the cottonwood, which she could see from the road, and she looked at the flat stone she had placed there, and she rode on to the mesa and sat and watched the sun go down over the Sangre de Cristo range and came back feeling somewhat better about the general state of things. She passed the gap again on the return journey. Dexter Fairchild was sitting on the top rail of the fence not far from the gap, watching the sunset, and he raised one hand in a greeting that was not quite a wave, more of an acknowledgement, the way a man tips his chin to another rider on the road. She raised a hand back and kept riding. The third time she passed the fence it was a Saturday morning and he was repairing a section of it about 200 yards north of the gap, driving new staples into a rotting post while his horse, a big gray, stood nearby with its reins draped over the wire. She pulled up because it would have been rude not to. "That post needs replacing," she said. He looked at the post and then at her. "It does," he agreed. "I'll get to it. There's a man in town who sells seasoned cedar, reasonably priced." "I know the man," Dexter said, a pause stretched between them comfortable enough. A red-tailed hawk turned lazy circles in the sky above them. "How are you getting on?" he asked, which surprised her because it was a personal question and she had not expected one from him. "Fine," she said. "Keeping busy. How are you?" "The same." He looked back at the post. "That cottonwood is a good tree. It'll do well for your dog." It was such a simple thing to say, and it landed directly in the center of her chest. "Thank you for what you did," she said. "I never properly thanked you." "It didn't require thanks," he said. "It required something," she said. "At minimum it required that I say it." She met his eyes. They were a dark hazel, the kind that shifted color depending on the light. "So, thank you, Dexter Fairchild." He held her gaze for a moment. "You're welcome, Pauline Quinn," he said. She rode on. She was smiling by the time she reached the edge of town. The thing about Creta in 1883 was that it was a town in the process of deciding what it was going to become. It had the bones of a permanent settlement, a proper main street, a courthouse, a school that met 3 days a week, 2 churches that did not agree with each other, and a small newspaper run by a man named Gideon Pratt who liked to editorialize about everything from the price of beef to the moral character of the territory's citizens. It had the restlessness of a town, not yet settled, miners passing through, cattle drives churning up the South Road, disputes over water rights that occasionally escalated beyond the purely verbal. The assay office where Pauline worked sat between the hardware store and the telegraph office, and she kept it orderly and precise, and treated every man who brought in a sample with the same level of professional neutrality, regardless of whether they were a large mining company or a lone prospector who had staked a claim in the hills to the east. This made her popular with the independent miners and somewhat less popular with the larger operations, particularly the Halloway Mining Company, which was run by a man named Cass Halloway who had made it quietly clear that he preferred assay numbers that leaned in his favor. Pauline had dealt with Cass Halloway by treating him exactly as she treated everyone else, which was to say with firm courtesy and complete accuracy, and he had dealt with her by complaining to the territorial office in Santa Fe, and the territorial office had sent a letter back that said her records were impeccable, and the matter was closed. Since then, Halloway had treated her with a coldness that she found much preferable to his previous attentiveness. She told Rodrigo about Dexter Fairchild on a Tuesday evening over cards, partly because she trusted Rodrigo and partly because she had been thinking about the man more than she thought she ought to, and she needed to hear herself speak of it aloud to understand what it was she was actually thinking. "Fairchild," Rodrigo said, laying down a card with the decisive movement of a man who plays cards the way he does everything else, with commitment. "I know the name. He ranches that land south of town." "He does," Pauline said. "He keeps to himself." "He does that too," she said, "but he helped me bury Biscuit." Rodrigo crossed himself briefly, which was his custom when someone mentioned the dog. "He was a good dog," he said. "Everyone keeps saying that," Pauline said. "He really was. And Fairchild, he just helped, no charge, no conversation. He dug the hole," Pauline said, "without being asked, and then he stood with me and didn't say anything unnecessary." Rodrigo studied his cards and then looked at her over the top of them with the particular expression of a man who is being careful about what he is about to say. "That is either a very decent man or a very strange one," he said. "It might be both," Pauline said. "And you like him." "I don't know him." "And you would like to know him," Rodrigo said, placing another card with the same decisive commitment. Pauline looked at her hand and decided not to answer, which was an answer in itself, and Rodrigo was far too sharp a man not to know that. She began to ride past the fence more regularly after that. Not every day, and not with any plan, or so she told herself. Sometimes she stopped to exchange a few words if Dexter was working the fence line or moving cattle in the near pasture, and sometimes she rode past without seeing him at all, and sometimes she saw him in town when he came in for supplies, and they exchanged a nod that was more than a nod but less than anything she could name. She came to understand in pieces that the town's version of Dexter Fairchild was not wrong exactly, just incomplete. He had kept to himself. The gate had been closed for company for 7 winters. That much was true. What the town had not bothered to understand was the reason, or the shape of the man behind the reason, because the town had lost interest when he declined to provide them with the kind of dramatic story they wanted. The reason, as she came to understand it gradually and in fragments, was this: his wife had died. Her name had been Marin. She had been young, 26 when she died, from a fever that swept the territory in the winter of 1876. They had been married 4 years. They had had a small son who had died with her in the same fever, a child not yet 2 years old. Dexter had buried them both in the ground on his own land, in the corner of the eastern pasture beneath a pair of juniper trees, and he had closed the gate and kept it closed and worked his land alone, and hired only occasional day labor when the work required more than one pair of hands. He had survived it. He had continued to function. He bought his supplies, paid his debts, kept his cattle in good order, and asked nothing of anyone. But the gate had stayed closed. Pauline learned this partly from Harriet Oakes, who had known Marin briefly and spoke of her with genuine sorrow, and partly from a few things Dexter said in their brief exchanges that suggested the shape of a larger story without stating it plainly. She was careful not to probe. She had her own version of a life quietly reconstructed after loss, even if her losses were of a different kind, and she understood the way a person builds walls that are not exactly walls, but are more like structures for organizing what you can bear to think about on any given day. The November of 1883 came in hard, bringing early cold and a wind that cut across the mesa without apology. Pauline was riding back from a site visit, a small independent claim to the east of town, whose owner, a man named Pete Alderman, had been in dispute with a Halloway Company surveyor about the boundary of his claim, and had asked her to come out and look at the geological record, when her mare threw a shoe in the rutted road about a mile south of Creta. She dismounted and walked, leading the horse, and she was moving along the fence line of the Fairchild property when the wind came up with real intent, and the first snow of the season began to fall in small, sharp crystals that stung her face. There was the gap in the fence. There was the cottonwood bare now, its branches like dark lines drawn against the white sky, and there was Dexter Fairchild moving cattle into the near barn, who saw her and stopped. "Horse threw a shoe," she called across the fence. He came toward the gap at a walk. "Come in," he said. "It's getting bad." She led the mare through the gap, which the horse navigated with a few extra sidesteps of skepticism, and followed Dexter to the barn. It was a good barn, well built and tight, smelling of hay and horses, and the particular warm, dusty comfort of a space occupied by animals. He found a stall for her mare and checked the hoof, and said the horse was fine, just needed the shoe replaced, and that could be done in the morning if she wanted to wait out the storm. "I can't impose," she said. "You're not imposing," he said, in a tone that indicated the conversation on this particular subject was finished. The house was spare but not uncomfortable, which was the word that rose in Pauline's mind as she stood in the front room holding her coat and looking around. It had clearly been set up with some care once, with a rug on the floor and good curtains at the windows, and a stone fireplace that still held a fire banked from that morning. But it had the quality of a space where someone had stopped adding to things at a certain point and had simply maintained what was already there. The shelves held books and practical items. There were no ornaments to speak of, no small personal touches of the kind that accumulate when a household is actively growing. It was a house that had been paused. Dexter built the fire up and she sat near it, and he made coffee on the iron stove in the kitchen, moving through his own house with a quiet efficiency, and she watched without staring and thought about the shape of solitude and what it cost a person. He brought the coffee and sat in a chair across from her. The snow was coming down hard against the windows now, and the sound of it against the glass was steady and soft. "You've been riding out to the alderman claim," he said. It was not a question. "He asked me to assess the boundary dispute," she said. "Holloway's been pushing hard on those small claims," Dexter said. "3 of my neighbors lost land last year. Fair documentation, but they couldn't get anyone to look at it properly." "I looked at Alderman's today," Pauline said. "His original claim documentation is solid. The surveyor Holloway sent out repositioned a marker deliberately." Dexter's expression was careful. "Can you prove that?" "I can demonstrate the discrepancy," she said. Whether that rises to proof in a territorial court is another question. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him thinking it through, and she liked watching him think because he did it honestly, without performing. "There are 4 other claim holders to the east who might have the same issue," he said. "If you could assess all of them together, the pattern might be harder to ignore." "I've been thinking the same thing," she said. He looked at her with what she could only call attention, the full kind, not the kind that is just waiting for its turn to speak. "You're not afraid of him," Dexter said. "Holloway." "I'm appropriately cautious," she said. "But he is accountable to territorial law just like everyone else, and I'm not going to adjust my numbers because he prefers different ones." Dexter was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "My land is in the northeast corner adjacent to 2 of those claims. If Holloway moves on them, he might move on me next. Do you have your documentation in order?" "I believe so," he said. "I could bring it to you to check." "Do that," she said. "Better to know." The storm settled around the house, and they talked, which was remarkable to Pauline in a way she did not entirely account for until later. They talked about the Holloway situation, and about territorial law, and about the geological formations in the hills to the east that made them worth fighting over. They talked about the cattle market, which Dexter knew thoroughly, and she knew in the way of a person who processes a lot of information adjacent to an industry without being inside it. He asked about her work at the assay office and asked intelligent questions and listened to her answers. And she told him about Missouri, and he told her about Ohio, which was where he had grown up before coming west with Marin in 1872. He said the name without flinching and without making it heavy, and she accepted it without comment and without false sympathy, which she sensed was what he needed. He cooked supper, a simple thing, beans and salt pork and cornbread from a pan he had already made that morning, and she ate more than she had expected to because she had not realized how cold she was until she was warm again. He cleared the dishes without asking, and she dried them without being asked, and they moved around the kitchen in a way that was not quite domestic, but gestured in that direction. He showed her to a spare room that was clean and had a quilt on the bed and a small window through which she could see nothing but snow and darkness. She thanked him and meant it. She lay in the bed in the spare room of Dexter Fairchild's paused house and listened to the storm and the sound of his footsteps moving through the house until they stopped, and she felt something in her chest that she identified, slowly and with some wariness, as contentment. She rode back to town in the morning on a horse that Dexter had reshoed at first light, which meant he had been up before dawn in the cold working iron, and she thought about that all the way into Creta. The documentation question proved to be the thread that brought them together most practically in the weeks that followed, because Dexter did bring his papers to the assay office, and she went through them with him and found them solid. And then she reached out to the other claim holders he had named and found their documentation also solid, and the pattern she had expected to find was exactly there, and exactly as clear as she had hoped. 6 claims along the Eastern Survey line showed the same deliberate discrepancy in Holloway's repositioned markers. Rodrigo helped her organize the claim holders into a meeting, which took place in the back room of the hardware store on a cold December evening. All 6 of them, plus Rodrigo and Harriet Oakes, who had a piece of land out there she had inherited from her husband and had not known was potentially involved. Pauline laid out the documentation on the hardware counter and explained what she had found, calmly and precisely, and the men listened to her with the concentrated attention of people whose livelihoods are at stake. Dexter sat at the back of the room during this meeting, not speaking, only listening, and she was aware of him there the way you are aware of something that anchors a room without dominating it. Gideon Pratt from the newspaper came to that meeting uninvited, and she had almost sent him away, but Rodrigo said let him stay. A press witness might be useful, and she trusted Rodrigo's judgment on such things. Pratt sat in the corner and made notes, and did not print anything she asked him not to print, which raised her opinion of him considerably. After the meeting, when everyone else had gone, Dexter helped her roll up the survey maps and pack the documentation back into the case she had brought it in. The hardware store was cold without the body heat of 8 people in it, and a candle on the counter threw its light in a small circle that barely reached the 2 of them. "That was well done," he said. "It's not done yet," she said. "I need to get this to the territorial office in Santa Fe before Holloway can move on any of the claims." "I can ride to Santa Fe," he said. She looked at him. "You don't need to do that." "I have a stake in this literally," he said, "and I have a good horse and I know the route. It'll be faster than the stage." She was quiet for a moment, weighing it. She wanted to go herself. It was her work, her documentation, and she had a principle about following things through. But the timing was difficult. She had 3 samples waiting at the office that were time-sensitive, and if she was gone 4 days, the independent miners who needed those results would be left without answers that affected their operational decisions. "Take a copy of everything," she said. "I'll make one tonight." "I can stay and help," he said. "It's tedious work." "I'm not afraid of tedious work," he said. They sat at the table in the back room of the assay office for 3 hours that night, Pauline writing and Dexter holding lamps and organizing pages, and doing it without complaint. And somewhere in the second hour, she looked up and found him watching her write with an expression that he had not intended her to see, she thought, because when he noticed her looking, he shifted his gaze back to the pages in front of him without a word. But she had seen it, and she knew what it was. She also knew that she had been watching him in exactly the same way when she thought he was not looking. So she folded that knowledge away and said nothing, and went back to her copying. He rode to Santa Fe the next morning before the sun was properly up, and she stood in the doorway of the assay office and watched him go until the gray horse carried him around the bend in the road, and she could not see him any more. He was back in 4 days, as he had said. He brought a letter from the Territorial Land Commissioner confirming that an investigation into the survey discrepancies would be opened, and that all claims would be frozen at current boundaries pending the investigation. Holloway could not move on any of the properties while the investigation was active. He handed her the letter across the counter of the assay office with no drama, just the plain fact of it. She read it twice. She could feel the relief in her chest like something that had been wound tight slowly releasing. "Thank you," she said. "You did the work," he said. "I just carried the paper." "Dexter," she said, and something in the way she said his name made him stop and look at her directly. "Thank you." He held her gaze, and this time neither of them looked away. "You're welcome, Pauline Quinn," he said. It was December of 1883, and the territory of New Mexico lay under a pale, cold sky, and something was happening between these two people that neither of them was ready to name yet. But both of them felt with the certainty of people who have been very careful for a long time, and have stopped being entirely careful without quite deciding to. Christmas came and went quietly. The territory celebrated it the way frontier towns did, a service at each of the two churches that did not agree with each other, a gathering at the saloon that was technically secular but felt vaguely communal, and children in the street with whatever small gifts their families could manage. Pauline spent the day with Harriet and Clara and Rodrigo's family, who kept her at their table until late evening and fed her enough tamales that she was not hungry again until the following afternoon. On the day after Christmas, she rode out toward the mesa. She was not specifically riding toward the Fairchild fence line. She was riding toward the mesa. It happened that the road went past the fence line. He was at the gap. Not working, not repairing anything, just standing there with his arms resting on the top wire, looking at the cottonwood in the way of a man who happens to be standing somewhere without a particular objective. He turned when he heard her horse. "Merry Christmas, one day late," she said. "The same to you," he said. He looked at her for a moment. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" She had been through the gap in his fence 3 times now, once to bury biscuit, once in the snow when her mare threw a shoe, and now. Each time he had not offered to open the gate. The gate was at the head of the lane leading up to the house, a proper swinging gate with iron hardware that she could see from where she stood, closed as it always was. The gap in the fence was here, modest and practical, and he was standing beside it with his arms on the wire, and he was not going to the gate, and she understood, without it being explained to her, that the gap was what he could offer right now and the gate was a different thing entirely, and she was fine with the gap. She dismounted and tied her horse to the post. She came through the gap. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and the remains of a dried apple cake that he said he had made 2 days ago from a recipe his mother had used. He gave her the recipe when she asked for it, writing it out from memory on a page from the small notebook he kept in his shirt pocket for farm calculations. He had good handwriting, small and precise. She told him about Rodrigo's family's Christmas dinner and about the tamales, and he smiled more fully than she had seen him smile before, something that rearranged his face considerably for the better, and said that he had eaten tamales at a similar Christmas table in his 2nd year in the territory, and thought it was the best meal he had ever had in his life. "Do you get lonely out here?" she asked, and then immediately regretted asking because it was the kind of direct personal question she generally did not ask. He did not seem to mind. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I got used to it," he said. "That's not the same as no, but the loneliness changed shape after a while. It became more like quiet." He looked at the window. "The quiet hasn't been bothering me as much lately." She understood what he meant and why he had said it and what it cost him to say it, and she let the silence after it be simply what it was. "I should tell you something," she said after a while. He looked at her. "I am not very good at being careful with people," she said. "I know that seems contradictory to how I present myself, but I tend to care about things very thoroughly when I start caring about them, and I do not do it halfway, and that has caused me difficulty in the past." She paused. "I am telling you this because it seems honest, and because I think you are also a person who prefers honesty, even when it is uncomfortable." Dexter was very quiet. He looked at the coffee cup, and then he looked at her, and his expression was the most open she had seen it, which was like watching a door that had been closed for a long time move on its hinges. Not fully open, not yet, but moving. I know what it is to care about something so thoroughly that when it goes wrong the damage is complete, he said. I'm not trying to say I won't care. I am saying that caring again is something I have been afraid of for longer than I expected to be afraid of it. That makes sense to me, she said quietly. I think, he said slowly, that you being here is the first thing in a long time that has felt like it might make sense in the other direction. She let herself feel what that meant and did not try to reduce it or manage it. She nodded once, and he nodded once, and they drank their coffee while the pale winter light moved across the kitchen floor, and it was enough. January of 1884 came in with the snow that December had promised, and then partly withheld. The territory whitened and stiffened, and the cattle were kept in closer, and the road into Creta became a track through mud and ice that required more attention and more time. Pauline rode it anyway on the days she rode out, because the road is the road and the destination is the destination, and she was not going to let weather make her decisions for her. She went through the gap in the fence on a Tuesday in January and found Dexter at the barn repairing a door that the wind had damaged, working in the cold with his breath steaming, and she held the door straight for him while he reset the hinges, which took both of them for about 20 minutes, and was the kind of simple cooperative work she found she liked very much. When the door was right, she helped him move a hay bale, and then they stood in the barn aisle with the horses shifting in their stalls and the cold pushing at the barn walls, and he said, without looking at her, "I went and looked at the gate this morning." She waited. "I haven't opened it in a long time," he said. "Not for company." "I know," she said. "I used to think about opening it," he said, "and then I stopped thinking about it because the thinking was harder than just leaving it closed." She watched his profile. He was looking at the wall above the horses. "And now?" she asked. He turned and looked at her. "And now I'm thinking about it again," he said. "That's all I can say right now. I'm thinking about it." "That's enough," she said. She meant it. He searched her face as though checking the truth of it, and whatever he found there satisfied him, because he let out a breath and looked back at the horses and said, "There's a colt I've been meaning to ask your opinion on. He has an unusual gait." She followed him down the barn aisle to look at the colt, which was young and very pretty, and did have an unusual gait, a short stride on the left fore that Pauline thought was probably a minor conformational issue rather than lameness. And they spent half an hour discussing it, and looking at the foot and watching the colt move in the aisle, and the conversation was easy and specific and pleasant. She told Rodrigo about the gate conversation. Rodrigo listened with his full attention, which was one of his best qualities, and when she had finished he said, "He is telling you he is trying." "I know," she said. "And are you telling him anything?" "I told him about how I care about things too thoroughly," she said. "Pauline," Rodrigo said, with the patience of a man who is fond of someone and finds them occasionally maddening, "that is not the same as telling him how you feel about him specifically." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said again. "He sounds like a man who will wait as long as you need," Rodrigo said. "But he has already been waiting 7 years in his way. Do not make him wait longer than is necessary." She thought about that on the ride home and for several days afterward. February arrived, and with it, the beginning of the territorial investigation into Holloway's survey discrepancies, which was more formal and more substantial than Pauline had dared expect. An investigator named Hartwell came up from Santa Fe with 2 deputies and a territorial surveyor, and they spent 2 weeks going over the eastern claim lines and interviewing every claim holder and looking at every piece of documentation. Pauline was interviewed for an entire afternoon, and she gave her answers precisely and thoroughly and without embellishment. And when Hartwell left, he told her that her original documentation was the clearest record he had encountered in 3 years of this kind of work. Cass Holloway came to the assay office during this period and sat across the counter from her and spoke to her in a voice that was quiet in the way of men who are used to their quiet being frightening. He said that she had gone to a great deal of trouble over a matter that he would eventually resolve in his favor regardless, and that it might have been wiser to consider her position in this town more carefully before making enemies of people who had significant influence. Pauline listened to all of this without moving and without changing her expression. When he finished, she said, "Mr. Halloway, your survey team repositioned 6 legal markers on documented claims. I recorded what I found. That is my job, and I did it correctly. If you have concerns about the investigation process, I suggest you direct them to the Territorial Commissioner's office in Santa Fe. Is there anything else I can help you with today?" He left without answering. She sat very still for about 2 minutes after he left. Then she went into the back room and took a number of slow, controlled breaths. She did not tell Dexter about the Halloway visit directly, but Gideon Pratt's newspaper had a piece about the investigation that week that mentioned her by name as the assier who had brought the discrepancies to official attention. And the next time she rode past the fence line, Dexter was at the gap and said, "I read Pratt's piece," and looked at her with an expression that was specific and focused. "Halloway came to talk to me," she said. "It was fine." Dexter's jaw tightened. "When?" "Tuesday." He was not threatening exactly, he was suggesting. "That's not fine," Dexter said. "It's managed," she said. "He's not going to do anything overt while the investigation is active. He has too much to lose. When the investigation closes," Dexter said, "then we will deal with what he does next," she said. "I am not going to run from him." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him deciding between concern and respect, and it was gratifying to watch respect win. "No," he said, "I don't imagine you would a bit. You should not have to deal with this alone." "I'm not," she said. "I have Rodrigo and Harriet and Pratt watching, and now I have you watching." Something happened in his face when she said, "and now I have you." It was not dramatic, it was subtle, the way things that matter are often subtle, but she saw it clearly. "Yes," he said, "you do." March came and the snow began to thin, and the territory started its annual argument with itself about whether to become mud or stay frozen, and the answer was always some of both and neither completely. The assay office was busy with the spring surge of mining activity, and Pauline worked long hours and ate her supper most evenings at Harriet's table and fell into bed in her room above the general store with the satisfaction of days fully used. She still rode out twice a week when she could manage it. She still came through the gap in the fence. He always seemed to know she was coming, or perhaps he was simply often near the fence in the afternoon and the timing coincided, and she did not examine this too closely, because examining it too closely would reduce something she preferred to leave unreduced. One afternoon in late March she came through the gap, and he was standing there, and he said, without preamble, "There's something I want to show you," and led her through the pasture to the eastern corner where the 2 juniper trees grew. There were 2 stones beneath the trees. They were well kept, the ground around them clear of brush. She stood beside him and looked at them and felt the weight of it and did not try to make it lighter. "Pauline Fairchild," she read from the nearer stone, and then below the name and dates, "and Thomas Dexter Fairchild, beloved son, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord." He would have been almost 9 now, Dexter said. "Thomas," Pauline's throat tight. She stood very still. "I don't bring people here," Dexter said. "I haven't, but I wanted you to see it." He paused. "I've been thinking about why, and I think it is because it is the most important thing on this land, and I didn't want it to be something you didn't know about." She understood what he was telling her and why he was telling her and how much it cost him to do it. She turned and looked at him, and his face was very still, but his eyes were not still at all, and she put her hand on his arm. She did not say anything because there was nothing to say that the gesture did not already say. He put his hand over hers briefly, and then they stood there for a while longer and then walked back through the pasture in the early spring light without speaking, and it was the most intimate thing that had happened between them yet. April brought the territorial investigation's conclusion. The commissioner's ruling came by telegraph and then by official letter, and Pauline read both in the assay office with Rodrigo beside her. The ruling was in favor of the 6 claim holders. The original survey markers were to be restored and documented. The Halloway Company was fined substantially and placed under monitoring for a period of 2 years, meaning any further survey work they commissioned in the territory would require independent verification. It was a complete vindication of everything she had said and documented from the beginning. She read the letter twice and then set it down on the counter. "Congratulations," Rodrigo said. "It is the law working correctly," she said. "That is not a remarkable thing. It should happen this way. And yet it often does not," he said, "which is why it matters when someone makes it happen." She folded the letter carefully and put it in the file she kept on the matter. Cass Halloway did not come back to the assay office. He left Creta 2 weeks after the ruling and did not return, and his company's operations in that part of the territory were scaled back considerably, which was not a tragedy that Pauline spent much time mourning. She rode out to the Fairchild fence that afternoon because it seemed right to tell him in person. He met her at the gap with the manner of a man who has been doing things all day and is ending the day where he wants to be, which was, increasingly, wherever she was. "It's settled," she said, and told him the ruling. He listened and then he said, "Come in." And she came through the gap and they walked to the porch of the house and sat on the steps in the late afternoon sunlight, which was genuinely warm for the first time that year. The kind of warmth that arrives in April in the territory of New Mexico and makes you understand why people come here and stay. He made coffee and they sat with it on the steps and the land spread out around them in the long light, and the cattle moved in the far pasture and a hawk rode the air above the juniper trees. "I'm glad you came to the territory," he said. "I'm glad I did too," she said. "I'm glad you went through the gap in the fence," he said. She turned and looked at him. The sun was in his hair and his eyes were that shifting hazel, and he was looking at her with no pretense and no management and no armor. And she understood that this was a man who had been putting himself back together very slowly and with great care, and who was now, right now, in this moment, offering her what he had put back together. "Dexter," she said, "I know it's been a long time since I've known what I wanted," he said, "but I know what I want now. I'm not going to be foolish about it and pretend otherwise." "I don't want you to pretend otherwise," she said. He reached over and took her hand, and that was all, just her hand in his with the spring light around them and the land and the hawk and the evening coming on slowly, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the kind of thing a person writes down in their heart and keeps there. She rode back to Creta that evening in the last of the light and stopped at Rodrigo's to borrow a cup of coffee she did not actually need. And when she sat at his table, he looked at her and said nothing at all, just smiled, which was its own kind of eloquence. May of 1884 was the best month Pauline could remember in some years, which she recognized as a strong statement and did not make it lightly. The territory was green in the places it got green, which was more places than people from the East expected, and the work at the assay office was interesting and busy, and she was good at it and knew she was good at it. And twice a week, she rode through the gap in the fence and sat on the porch steps with Dexter, or helped him with whatever was being done that day, or sat at the kitchen table while he cooked and talked to her about the cattle or the weather, or the books he was reading from the shelf in the front room. She brought him a book from the small lending collection at the general store, a novel she had finished and thought he would like, and he read it in 3 days and gave it back with his opinion of it, which was thoughtful and specific. And they talked about the book for a long time, and she thought, "This is what I have been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it. A person I can think alongside." He fixed the gap in the fence in the 2nd week of May. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon and found that the 2 leaning posts had been straightened, and the wire between them had been stretched tight and attached properly. And for a moment she stood at the road looking at the fence and feeling something she could not quite name. Then she looked up the lane toward the gate and found Dexter standing at the gate with his hand on the iron latch. He swung the gate open. She stared at him from the road, and he looked back at her, and she could see what it cost him and what it meant to him and how long the distance was between 7 winters of a closed gate and this moment of opening, and she felt something in her chest that was very large and very warm. She walked her horse through the gate, which felt ceremonial and profound and like something that needed to be done with full attention. She stopped just inside and looked at him. "I fixed the gap," he said. "I see that," she said. "I fixed it because I want you to use the gate," he said, "and I want the gate to be open when you come." She dismounted and stood in front of him with the horse behind her and the lane stretching up to the house and the territory around them, and she said, "Dexter Fairchild, I am in love with you." He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched the thing that moved across his face, which was not surprise exactly but something more like recognition, like a man who has been looking at a landscape for a long time and finally understands what he is seeing. "I know," he said. "I love you too. I think I have for a while. I've been working up to telling you." "You opened the gate," she said. "That told me." He smiled, and it was the full smile now, the one that rearranged his face entirely, and she thought she could look at that smile for a very long time without finding the need for anything else. He kissed her there, standing in the open gate, with the lane ahead of them and the land in all directions and the spring sky above, and it was a good kiss, careful and certain and real, the kind that is made between two people who have both been hurt and have both healed and have both decided to be brave about it anyway. June and July of 1884 passed in a way that Pauline experienced as both very full and very fast, which she recognized as the quality of time when it is being used well. She was at the Fairchild property so often that Harriet Oakes began to tease her with the gentle accuracy of a woman who knows how things stand before anyone announces them. Rodrigo said nothing, only that the color in her face was better than it had been in the 2 years he had known her, and she threw a card at him across the table, and he caught it and laughed. The two of them, Pauline and Dexter, settled into each other with a naturalness that still surprised her sometimes, because she had expected it to be difficult or awkward or complicated by the weight of his history, and it was none of those things. It was easy in the way that good and real things are easy, not effortless, but right, the way work is easy when you are doing the work you are supposed to be doing. He told her things about Marin. Not constantly, not in a way that made her feel like a replacement or a shadow, but in the way of a man who has been keeping someone's memory private for a long time and has decided it is time to let it breathe. She listened and asked small questions and kept what he told her carefully, because they were important things and deserved to be kept that way. He told her that Marin would have liked her, which he said with a quiet directness that moved her considerably. She told him things about Missouri and about the man she had thought she might marry and about why she had left, and he listened with the same full attention he gave to everything she said, and at the end he said, "He was a fool," with such simple certainty that she laughed until she had to put her hand over her mouth. On a Saturday in late July, sitting on the porch steps in the heat of the late afternoon, Dexter turned to her and said, "I want to ask you something." She waited. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said, "but I want to ask it properly. So I am telling you first that I am going to ask and then I am going to ask." He paused. "Pauline Quinn, will you marry me?" She had known this was coming, not because she had engineered it or pushed for it, but because the shape of what they were to each other pointed clearly in this direction, and she had been ready for it for some weeks. But being ready for it did not diminish the feeling of it, which was enormous and warm and completely sincere. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Dexter Fairchild." He produced a ring from his shirt pocket, which was a small gold band with a single turquoise stone set in it, which was not what she might have predicted but was absolutely right, and something she would not have traded for anything more elaborate. He had clearly had it made locally, she suspected by the silversmith in the next town, because it was handmade and personal, and had the quality of something chosen specifically for her rather than simply purchased. He put it on her finger and she turned her hand in the afternoon light and looked at the turquoise, which was the color of the sky on a clear, high-altitude morning, and felt that she was precisely where she was supposed to be. They were married in September of 1884 in the smaller of Creta's two churches, which did not require a great deal of negotiation, once the pastor understood that neither of them had any interest in a large ceremony. Rodrigo and his wife, a quiet and lovely woman named Esperanza, stood with them. Harriet Oakes sat in the front pew and wept with the efficient sincerity of a woman who has been hoping for this event for months. Clara Bento brought flowers from her garden, yellow and orange, and the kind of late summer blooms that made the inside of the small church smell like something that mattered. Dexter wore his best suit, which was dark and clean and made him look even taller than usual, and Pauline wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself in the weeks prior, which was practical because the blue would last and serve many occasions. She had put her hair up and borrowed Harriet's pearl earrings, and Rodrigo had told her she looked beautiful, and Dexter, when he saw her come down the aisle, looked at her with an expression that rendered any other compliment entirely unnecessary. The pastor read the vows in English and they each repeated them, and when Dexter's voice said "I do," it was steady and full and nothing in it suggested anything other than complete sincerity, and when Pauline's voice said "I do," it was the same. The pastor pronounced them married, and the small congregation, which was Rodrigo and Esperanza and Harriet and Clara, and a few others from town who had managed to be warmly invited without a formal invitation, made the small joyful noise of people who have witnessed something that is good and true. They had their celebration at the Fairchild property, which was the first time the front gate had been opened wide for company in 7 winters, and the gate stood open all through that afternoon and evening while people came and ate and talked and moved between the house and the yard in the September warmth. Rodrigo played guitar. Harriet organized the food with the efficiency of a general organizing a campaign. Dexter moved through his own property with a look on his face that she kept catching from the corner of her eye, a look of a man who has returned to something after a long absence and found it more than he remembered. She moved her things from the room above the general store the following week. It did not take very long, which she thought said something useful about how lightly she had always been prepared to hold any particular place. Harriet hugged her at the door and said, "Come have supper on Wednesdays," and Pauline said she would, and she did, because Harriet's table was one of the good things of Creta, and she saw no reason to leave it behind just because her address had changed. She brought her furniture and her books and her tools of work, which she continued at the assay office 4 days a week, and intended to continue indefinitely. She brought Biscuit's collar, which she had kept, and hung it on a nail in the kitchen where she could see it. Dexter did not ask about the collar and did not comment on it, only looked at it once with a quiet recognition of what it was, and that was that. Life on the Fairchild property was different from life above the general store in the way that living somewhere with full commitment is different from living somewhere temporarily, even if you have been there for 2 years. There was more space in every sense. There was the land, which she came to know section by section, fence line by fence line, the pasture and the garden plot and the kitchen garden, and the places where the water ran after rain, and the places where the light fell differently in different seasons. There was the barn with its routines and the cattle with their rhythms and the horses who quickly formed opinions about her and expressed them with the specificity that horses use. She loved all of it with the thoroughness she had warned him about, which was to say completely and without reservation, and she could see that he loved watching her love it, which added a dimension to her enjoyment of each thing that she had not anticipated. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was a working winter in the best sense. They worked the ranch and she worked the assay office, and in the evenings they sat by the fire and read or talked or played cards against each other, and she almost always won because she was a better card player and did not pretend otherwise, and he found this consistently amusing and did not pretend otherwise either. She told him in January of 1885, She had known for 3 weeks and had kept the knowledge to herself for those 3 weeks, not because she was afraid of his response, but because she wanted to be certain, and she was certain now, and she told him on a Sunday morning in the kitchen over breakfast. He set down his coffee cup. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood and crossed the kitchen to where she was sitting and took her face in both his hands and looked at her with everything he had, which was considerable. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling all right?" "I am perfectly well," she said. He kissed her forehead and then sat down beside her rather than across from her and held her hand and was very quiet for a while. She let him be quiet and held his hand and drank her coffee and watched the morning light come through the kitchen window. "I am glad," he said finally. "I am more glad than I know how to say." "I can see that," she said. "And I am afraid," he said. "Which I want to name because I don't want to be dishonest about it." "I know," she said. She understood exactly what he feared, given what he had lost, and she did not minimize it. "We can be afraid and glad at the same time. There is room for both." He turned her hand over and looked at it. "Yes," he said, "there is." The months that followed were good ones. Busy with the particular industry of a household preparing for a new person, and the particular tenderness of two people who have each been through enough to understand how much any given good moment is worth. Pauline's sister-in-law sent things from Missouri by post once she was told, small soft items that arrived over several months and accumulated in the spare room they were preparing. Harriet made things and brought them on Wednesdays. Esperanza, Rodrigo's wife, who had 4 children of her own and was an encyclopedia of practical knowledge, came by regularly and advised on everything from the best way to set up the room to what she should and should not be eating. And Pauline received all of this with gratitude because she was a practical woman who saw no virtue in refusing help that was genuinely useful. Dexter was attentive without being suffocating, which was exactly right. He did more of the heavy work without being asked, and did it without making a performance of accommodation. He rode to Santa Fe once for a specific thing the local doctor had recommended, and was back in 3 days, and said nothing about the trouble of the trip. He sat with her in the evenings with his hand sometimes on her back, a steady, anchoring weight, and she found that she slept better with that weight there than she had slept in years. Their son was born in October of 1885, which was not an easy birth and a long one, and Pauline was tired in a way she had not previously understood the meaning of, a tiredness that was also entirely something else, relief and astonishment, and a joy so large it had no proper name. The doctor from Creta was there, and Esperanza, and Harriet, who had made herself useful from the moment she arrived and continued to be useful through all of it. Dexter was in the house the whole time. He was not in the room for the birth itself, the doctor and Esperanza having opinions about this, but he was directly outside the door and she could hear him there, his footsteps and his stillness alternating. When it was over and the doctor came out and told him, she heard no sound from him at all for a moment, and then she heard him make a sound that was not quite a word and was not quite anything else, and she knew that sound. She knew it exactly, and it came from the same place where the fear and the gladness lived together. He came in and sat beside her and held the boy, who was very small and red and entirely himself, with her hair already in the suggestion of dark curls at the temples. Dexter held him with the care of a man who is handling the most important thing he has ever held and is absolutely sure of it, and looked at him for a long time. Thomas was his first son's name, Pauline said quietly. She had been thinking about this. Dexter looked at her and his eyes were bright and full. "I thought about that," he said. "What do you think?" "I think that Thomas is a good name," she said, "and I think it belongs to your family, and I think this boy can have it and grow into it, and it will honor what came before without replacing it." Dexter looked at the boy again. "Thomas James Fairchild," he said. James was his father's name. "Thomas James." The boy made a small, unconcerned noise and moved his fingers and was entirely indifferent to the significance of the moment, which was, Pauline thought, entirely appropriate. Creta received Thomas James Fairchild with the warmth of a small western town that has been following a love story without quite acknowledging it is doing so. Rodrigo came by with Esperanza and their children, and was as formal and dignified about meeting the baby as he was about everything important in his life, which was to say very, and then went outside and leaned against the fence and was quietly emotional about it, which Esperanza told Pauline later with some fondness. Harriet brought food enough to last a week, and held the baby with the expertise of a woman who has done this before many times and knows how to make it look effortless. Gideon Pratt came by for a brief visit and was graciously not told enough to write anything about it, which he respected because he was, when it came down to it, a decent man. The winter of 1885 into 1886 was a full winter, crowded in the best sense with the noise and need of a small person, and the rearrangement that any new person requires of the space and routines and hours they enter. Thomas was a good baby who was opinionated about sleep in ways that kept both his parents educated about the multiple meanings of the word tired, and who was also deeply, obviously delighted by the world around him in a way that made every ordinary thing feel interesting to observe. Dexter was a father who surprised her somewhat, which was not an insult but an honest accounting. She had expected him to be careful, given the history, and he was careful. But he was also unguarded in a way she had not entirely predicted. Meeting his son with a directness and an openness that she understood was also a choice, a deliberate decision to love fully despite knowing what full love costs when it is taken from you. She loved him more for it than she had known was possible to love him, which was saying something because she had thought she had already reached the ceiling. He also began, in that winter, to fix other things around the property that he had let drift. The fence that had had the gap, the barn door he had repaired when she was first here but whose frame still needed work, a section of the pasture fence on the north side. Small things that had been adequate but not quite right, that he now made right, and she understood without him saying it that these were the actions of a man recommitting to a future in a place, which was different from simply maintaining one. They planted a kitchen garden in the spring of 1886 that was the best garden either of them had attempted. She knew plants from Missouri and the mild season, and he knew the territory soil and the water patterns, and between them they grew more than they needed and shared the excess with the town. Clara Bento, who was a gardener herself, came by to inspect it and approved without being condescending, which was her highest form of praise. Thomas, at 6 months, developed strong opinions about the garden and expressed them by attempting to eat several things he should not have eaten, and was retrievable from these attempts in time, and the look on his face each time his father lifted him away from the dirt was one of pure indignant intent that made both his parents have to turn away from him to laugh without his seeing. The summer of 1886 settled over the territory with the confident heat of a season that knows what it is. Pauline went back to 4 days a week at the assay office, bringing Thomas with her on 3 of those days in a basket that fit under the counter, and in which he slept approximately as often as he did not. And on the 4th day, Dexter kept him at the ranch with the comfort of a man who has developed, over several months, a thorough understanding of this particular small person and his preferences. The arrangement worked well enough, and she valued her work too much to leave it, and she had no intention of letting anyone suggest she ought to. The assay office had a new junior assistant by this point, a young man of 21 named Arvid who was diligent and earnest and initially terrified of her, and then, after approximately 6 weeks of firm, fair treatment, became a capable and loyal co-worker. She taught him the proper calibration of the scales and the documentation system she had developed, and the correct way to receive a sample and record it, and he absorbed all of it with the focused attention of someone who is determined to do the job correctly. The investigation into Halloway's practices had had a ripple effect that she had not entirely predicted, but was pleased by. 2 other territorial districts had initiated similar reviews of their survey records. She received a letter in August of 1886 from the Territorial Commissioner's office complimenting her documentation standards and asking if she would be willing to consult on one of the other reviews. And she wrote back saying she would be glad to provide written consultation and could travel to Santa Fe in October if a meeting was necessary. She told Dexter about the letter at supper. Thomas was in the chair beside the table that Dexter had built specifically for this purpose, engaged in the serious project of mashing something with the flat of his hand. "Will you go?" Dexter asked. "If they need me to, yes," she said. "It would only be 4 or 5 days." "Of course you should go," he said. "This is your work." She looked at him across the table. He met her eyes with the straightforward support of a man who has never once suggested that her work is anything other than exactly as important as it is. It was one of the things she had understood about him early and valued continuously. "I know I should," she said. "I'm telling you because I want to know what you think." "I think you built something important with that investigation," he said. "And I think if the territory wants your expertise on other situations like it, they're wise to ask for it and you should give it." She reached across the table and took his hand briefly, and Thomas chose this moment to fling the mashed item with impressive accuracy, and the moment became something else entirely, which was also fine. The October trip to Santa Fe was 4 days and productive. She met the commissioner's investigator and reviewed the documentation from the other district and made specific recommendations that the investigator wrote down thoroughly and with the air of someone who intends to use them. She walked in the Plaza de Santa Fe on the last evening, which she had seen before on brief visits but now took time to sit in and watch. The buildings and the people, and the particular quality of the light there, which was different from Creta's light in ways she could not fully articulate. She thought about how far she had come from Missouri. Not in miles only, though the miles were considerable, but in the sense of having arrived at the place she was supposed to be, which had not been the case in Missouri for a long time before she left. She thought about the gap in the fence and the cottonwood tree and the dog buried beneath it, and the man who had dug the hole without being asked. She thought about the gate standing open. She came home on the stage and then by horse the last 12 miles, arriving in the late afternoon. The gate was open when she turned up the lane. She could see it from the road, standing open, which it now always stood when she was expected or when the day was fine enough. She rode through it with the easy confidence of someone who belongs somewhere, which was what she was. Dexter was on the porch with Thomas on his hip, pointing at something in the pasture that the boy was examining with grave attention, and she pulled up her horse at the porch step and looked at the two of them, her husband with his dark and silver hair and his easy way of holding a child, and their son who had her curls and his jaw and the particular look of a person who intends to have opinions about everything. And she thought, this is it. This is the whole of what I wanted without knowing I wanted it. Every bit of it. The land and the work and the open gate and this man and this child and all of it. "Mama is home," Dexter said to Thomas, who looked at her with the expression of someone being informed of something they already knew. She dismounted and handed her reins to Dexter and took Thomas, who smelled of hay and soap and the specific warm smell that belongs to small children and to no one else, and she kissed the top of his head and looked at her husband. "How was it?" he said. "Good," she said. "Useful. I'll tell you all of it at supper." "There's stew," he said. "Rodrigo's wife sent the recipe you asked for." "I love that woman," Pauline said. "I'll tell her," Dexter said. He took the horse to the barn, and she went into the house with Thomas on her hip, through the front door of the house that was now entirely hers, past the shelf in the kitchen where Biscuit's collar hung on its nail, into the warmth and the good smell of Esperanza's stew recipe. And everything was right and closed and complete, and she felt it all through herself like something warm she had been carrying for a long time, and finally set down somewhere it could stay. 2 years later, in the spring of 1888, Pauline found herself on the porch steps in the April morning watching Thomas, who was 2.5 and engaged in the determined project of trying to teach the barn cat something. She was not sure what, and thinking about things with a satisfaction that had only deepened over time. The assay office was doing well. Arvid was capable enough now to manage it on her shorter days, and the consultation work had brought her into a kind of professional standing in the territory that she had not planned for but found she was glad of. She had recently confirmed, expecting again, which she had told Dexter the previous evening, and which he had received with a joy that was no less full for being, this time, accompanied by considerably less fear. He came out of the barn and came across the yard and sat beside her on the porch steps and followed her gaze to where Thomas was now engaged in monologue directed at the cat, who was regarding him with the patient neutrality of a cat who has determined this is not dangerous. "He talks a lot," Dexter observed. "He gets that from me," Pauline said. "I know," Dexter said with no particular emphasis, and she laughed. He put his arm around her and they sat in the April morning and watched their son explain something at length to an indifferent cat. And the land was green in the places it got green, and the gate was open at the head of the lane, and a hawk was turning somewhere above the juniper trees in the eastern pasture, and the sky was that high clear turquoise that matches the stone on her finger. And Creta was a small western town in the territory of New Mexico, still in the process of becoming what it was going to be. And so were they, the two of them. And the becoming was full of exactly the kind of richness that comes from starting from nothing and building deliberately and loving without armor. Dexter had not opened the front gate for company in 7 winters. And then one morning she had not used the gate anyway. She had used the gap in the fence, with a dog in a flour sack and a small folding shovel and a heart that was tired and needed a good tree. And he had let her. He had not asked her to leave, had not explained the gate or its history, had just picked up the big spade and dug the hole properly and stood with her in the shade of the cottonwood, and everything that came after came from that. She sometimes thought about that morning the way you think about the hinge point of a story, the place where everything turns, where the direction that was set begins to be legible. The gap in the fence and the cottonwood and the flat stone she had set at the head of Biscuit's grave. The man with the spade and the hat he had taken off before he spoke to her. He had let her in, not through the gate, not yet, not then, through the gap, which was what he had. And she had been content with the gap, because she understood instinctively that the gap was the honest offer, and the gate would come when it was ready. And it had, and she had walked through it on a May afternoon in the spring of her life, and the gate had been standing open ever since. Thomas ran over to them with the energy of a small person who has been sitting still for 30 seconds and finds this entirely insufficient. He climbed into his mother's lap, and from there attempted to climb to his father's shoulders, which was his preferred destination, and Dexter lifted him up there with the ease of a man who has done this thousands of times by now, and the boy sat up there with his small hands on his father's head and looked at the morning as though it belonged to him, which, Pauline thought, in the truest sense it did. She put her hand on Dexter's back, and he turned and looked at her with the full particular attention that had always been his most significant quality, the kind of looking that sees everything and requires nothing in return, and she held his gaze the way she had learned to hold it without looking away, because there was nothing in what she felt that she needed to hide from it. "Good morning," she said, though it was not early any more, the morning well along toward noon. "Good morning," he said. He smiled. The full smile, the one she had been watching for 2 years before she saw it and had been watching ever since, still finding in it the thing that she had found the first time, which was the face of a man fully present to his own life. The hawk passed over the juniper trees and banked south toward the mesa, and somewhere in the pasture, a cow made a sound that was either a complaint or a greeting, the distinction not always clear with cattle, and Thomas laughed at the sound from his high seat on his father's shoulders and said something that was not quite a word but was entirely a sentence. And the New Mexico spring morning went on around them with the inexhaustible patience of a landscape that has been here longer than any of them and intends to be here long after. And in the middle of it, these two people and their boy were simply what they were, which was whole. The gate would stay open. She had made sure of that in every way that mattered, had walked through it and stayed and put her things inside and her name on the land deed and her heart in the hands of the man who had finally, after 7 long winters, decided to let someone in through the proper door. Not just through the gap, through the gate, though she had always been glad of the gap. The gap had been the beginning. The gap and the cottonwood and the good dog buried beneath it, and the flat stone she had set at the head of his grave in the shade, while a quiet man with a spade waited without hurrying her, and the whole long, patient, ordinary, extraordinary story of how two people who had each lost something found each other in the space of a New Mexico morning, and built, from that morning, everything else. That evening she and Dexter sat on the porch after Thomas was in bed, as they often did, with the night coming on around the territory, and the stars arriving in their multitude the way they did out away from town, more stars than you could account for, filling the sky from edge to edge with a density that the east could not match. She had been struck by the stars when she first came west, and had never quite stopped being struck by them, which she considered a good sign about the caliber of her attention. He was reading, his book held at an angle to catch the last of the light from the window behind him. She was doing nothing in particular, which was an activity she had gotten better at over the past few years, having previously been someone who was uncomfortable with it. She had learned from him, who had a quality of stillness that was not emptiness but presence, a being in the moment without performance, and she had gradually acquired a version of it herself that fit her own nature. "I was thinking," she said, "that we should name the baby something plain." He looked up from his book. "Not Thomas." "Not Thomas," she agreed, "but something solid, something that will wear well." "What did you have in mind?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said. "I thought we might discuss it." He closed the book and set it on the step beside him and turned toward her with the full attention. "We have time," he said. "We have time," she agreed. The night pressed close around the house, warm and star-thick, and a coyote called from somewhere toward the mesa and another answered from a different direction, and the land breathed in the dark the way it had been breathing for centuries before either of them arrived, and would breathe long after. But that was the nature of living in the territory. You were part of something larger than yourself, and you either found that comforting or you did not, and Pauline Quinn Fairchild, who had come west alone in search of a life that fit, found it entirely comforting. Found it like what she had told Dexter she always did when she started caring about something, which was thoroughly and without reserve. She found the whole of it that way, every bit. The gate was open. The stars were out. Her husband was beside her and her son was asleep inside, and the territory spread out in all directions, wild and wide and full of the kind of future that you can only see from the porch of a place you have chosen fully, not stumbled into, not fallen back on, but chosen with the complete and clear-eyed intention of someone who has learned by hard experience what choosing really means. She had chosen this, and it was good. It was very, very good.